This is Keys to the Shop, episode 242, a conversation with James Hoffmann. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show, and I'm always happy to have you along. Hope you're having a great day. Now, if you haven't subscribed to this show, then I would encourage you to do that. You always get updated with new episodes. We produce about 9 episodes every month. That includes our Founder Friday episodes, the shift breaks on Thursdays, as well as the main content on Tuesdays. So subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I know a lot of you used CastBox. I use Overcast myself, but wherever you get your podcast, subscribe. And also, if this show has really been helpful for you and it is something you enjoy, I would encourage you to leave a review. Leave a 5-star review over on iTunes. I'm trying to get those ratings up there, maybe 200 ratings by the time the year is up. That was kind of an ambitious goal, but if you feel so inclined to do that, real quick to do, and I would so appreciate it. Now, on top of providing you this resource of Keys to the Shop as a podcast, Keys to the Shop also offers consultation for you and your business. If you're getting ready to open your first coffee business and you need some guidance to start you off on the right foot, avoid unnecessary mistakes, and really see things come together in a solid way the first time, then definitely we can have a conversation and can help you with that. Or if you already have a business, but you want to improve things in the coffee shop, you want to improve your employee relations, you want to raise the game with your systems, or maybe you're expanding and you need help and counsel on how to scale your business from 1 to 2 stores or beyond. This is something that Keys to the Shop can also help you with through on-site training and consultation or over the phone. Just email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. We could set up a phone call where we can talk about how we might be able to work together, and Keys to the Shop can help you in your situation. Again, the email, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Prima Coffee is one of the world's leading specialty coffee equipment suppliers, and what really puts them ahead of a lot of those suppliers out there is not only that they curate the best equipment from all over the globe, consistently staying on top of what's new, what works well, to serve you well, to make sure that you have a selection of the best equipment, but also they work to outfit their customers with the right equipment for their context, to work with you to make sure you're getting the right grinders, espresso machines, under-counter refrigeration, smallwares. It runs the gamut over at prima-coffee.com. When you go to that website, prima-coffee.com, you'll see the amazing selection, but also you'll see their dedication to your success in the form of a ton of resources, teaching you about the equipment itself, how to maintain it, even how to brew great pour-overs and pour latte art, because they're about equipping you not just with the equipment, but also the tools and knowledge to succeed in using that equipment. And that's why I love working with Prima Coffee, and I think you will as well. So reach out to them, see how they can help you out. Again, that website, prima-coffee.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by the wonderful folks over at the Pacific Barista Series. The Barista Series is the world's leader in plant-based performance beverages. And these beverages, almond, soy, coconut, rice, oat, hemp, any one you choose is going to perform amazingly on the bar, stand up to the heat from steaming, produce amazing quality texture for latte art, and also keep the balance of the beverage focused on coffee. And the reason why it performs so well on the bar is because they test this stuff tirelessly on the bar. They put it out there in the field with some of the world's best baristas. They take their feedback, they tweak the recipes, then they launch this product, and you get a beverage that works amazingly, and it pleases the palate of your most demanding plant-based customers. And so if you're wanting to serve your customers the best option for plant-based beverages, then I believe you cannot go wrong with choosing the Pacific Barista Series. Go to their website over at pacificfoodservice.com. Again, that's pacificfoodservice.com. Again, for the best in plant-based beverages, the choice to me is clear. It's the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody, so today we have a very special episode because we have the coffee legend himself, James Hoffmann, joining us on the show for a very great conversation. I loved this discussion with James. If you're not familiar with who James Hoffmann is the 2007 World Barista Champion and is the co-owner of Square Mile Coffee Roasters. It's a renowned coffee roastery in London, and he is the author of the World Atlas of Coffee, which is the authoritative resource on coffee from seed to cup and everywhere in between. Of course, James is the host and creator of one of the planet's most popular coffee YouTube channels, where he covers everything from home and commercial coffee equipment. He helps us break down and understand coffee brewing and espresso extraction, does crazy experiments, talks about coffee agronomy, and it just runs the gamut. It's a really fun channel that really covers anything to do with coffee, and he does such an amazing job clearly communicating the information. And I would consider James now a purveyor of both ideas for and about coffee that over the years have really helped us all navigate this landscape of the specialty coffee industry. And one of the many things I appreciate about James is that he is an excellent teacher and has the ability to be steady and insightful in his approach to topics and questions that can be at first a bit confusing. And that approach really helps welcome people into the world of coffee. In this conversation today, we discuss a lot about that. We cover questions around approachability and inclusivity in the way that we present coffee to the masses, what are helpful business mindsets, the role that the cafe has played in negatively impacting the industry, as well as the role the cafe can play in creating a more resilient industry. We talk about models that would be helpful post-COVID for coffee retailers and much more. There's a lot in this discussion. And again, I think the way that James breaks down his thoughts on these things is hugely helpful, insightful, and I think you're really going to get a lot out of it, of course. So it's an honor to get to have James on the show and to share this discussion with you. So without any more lead up from me, here now is my conversation with James Hoffmann. All right, James Hoffmann, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Such a pleasure to have you on the show.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I've really just thought, man, I really need to get James on the show. And you and I are a bit of contemporaries in the coffee industry, coming up along the same years. How many years has it been for you officially in coffee?
2003, I think, was my first coffee job. So what's that, 17 years now? You?
Yeah, 2000.
Okay.
And so it's all around the same, like the early aughts, if you will, where things were just really, it was a magical time. It was like the 80s for coffee.
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah. Some things we're very ashamed of and other things we're very, very proud of. You know, the challenge with having a conversation with someone that has had such a broad experience in coffee as yourself is knowing where to start. And I'm really excited to talk about the things we're talking about today because we are kind of getting at the root of a lot of stuff that I think maybe more people today are thinking about than they have been before. But I want to start by talking a little bit about your approach to coffee, because I think it's very unique in that you have this dual nature of being very nerdy about coffee and very deep into the details, but also there's a very disarming and approachable tenor to the way you express what you know about coffee, which is why your YouTube channel has blown up and why I think people like listening to you. So, I mean, that has to be on purpose, but how did that come to be and why that direction?
Firstly, thank you. That's very kind. Secondly, I think it's probably come from this being the kind of primary tension that I've been aware of, and I suppose I've talked about internally inside my own businesses, is that there's the sort of pull between needing to appeal to the kind of in the know audience, the discerning audience. You need them to trust you and believe in you and believe in your credibility because they are viral in the way that they talk about other businesses or other people. Because I think about this, that the one time recently I bought a bicycle. I don't really desperately care about bicycles. So when I need to buy a bicycle, I find my one friend who knows and cares deeply about bicycles, and I ask him which bike I should buy. And we all have those kind of friends or people we know that have their obsessions. And so I always felt I needed to find a way to connect with the people whose obsession was coffee and sort of appeal to them, I guess, is a really awkward phrase. That's kind of a half business thing more than it's a personal thing, I guess. I'm thinking about like Square Mile and coffee and all that kind of stuff. But if you only talk to them, then you do talk a language that nobody else understands. And that's the constant wrestling that a specialty coffee business can or maybe should have between wanting to talk to the people who really want to hear what you have to say, but how do you do that with language that doesn't exclude people who might want to know what you have to say or might care enough to support you or invest in your product or buy and drink your coffee and like it? You know, like, so that's been a tension that has been, you know, at the forefront of my mind for years now. And I suppose YouTube is or has been another extension of that, where I'm trying to ride the line where there's enough for people in the know and we get into some of the more detailed stuff, but we avoid language or posturing or kind of presentations that is excluding people who don't yet have the information that they might want. You know, I don't want it to be a barrier. I want you to be able to watch something and take away the learnings from it, but maybe almost like Easter eggs, there's like an extra layer or a little bit more, or a few sentences here and there to appeal to someone who's just that bit more involved and literate in that particular world of coffee nerdery.
Yeah, and that tension that you described, I think, is really interesting, that you need to have that moment in your speech, or like your friend that knows a lot about bikes. They have probably confused you at certain times, which in some weird way made you feel comfortable asking them about bikes, because it's
right
over your head, but they're the authority. But then how much of that it will push you away versus draw you in. That's a really interesting tension.
And I think with friends, though, it's very different, because you just accept that this person in your life is weird about that thing. And you're okay with that. And you trust them as much as you trust them as a friend, kind of thing. So, you know, from I suppose, without making it creepy and gross, from a marketing perspective, if you work in a particular industry, finding those people who care about your industry that way is so important, because they're such powerful sort of viral marketers of what you do. If you're doing a good thing and they understand that you're doing a good thing, then they want to talk about it, and that's very powerful.
It's interesting, too, that this is your friend, and were they not your friend, I wonder how likely you would have been to accept some of their advice, or at least if it's somebody who you have just met and you haven't built any kind of relational trust with. Imagine that's sort of like the X factor that kind of knits it together.
Well, trust is everything, right? Like, trust is so like a thing I think about a lot, worry about a lot, and I think you know, it's one of those things that's essential in any and all relationships. That's, you know, interpersonal relationships, familial relationships, and ultimately transactional relationships between companies and customers. Like, trust is something we don't talk about enough, and you know, the point that those relationships break down is often down to breaking trust. You know, the point at which you feel like a band sold out or a company sold out is that they have broken your trust in some way. I think it's very rooted in trust.
Yeah, indeed, and down to the very granular level of employee versus employer. I say versus. I'm used to sort of pitting the one against the other in some part of my mind, but yeah, the individual relationships versus the larger industry, the amorphous example of the consumer and the retailer, which is what we think about this a lot in terms of more broad market-based thinking patterns, I guess. But and that's kind of my next question to you is about that, because right now in coffee we see a explosion, and we were seeing growth in this, I think, a lot before COVID, and now as COVID has really amplified it, as from what I've seen, approachability in coffee and building a relationship where we're making it easy, like you make it easy to understand complex things on your YouTube channel, and other people at coffee bars are more likely to downplay these days the esoteric pieces of information in coffee than they used to be, all in a bid to sort of make specialty coffee easier. And the question that comes to my mind is, what is the limit for that? Like, it's specialty coffee, so there is, in some sense, exclusive nature to it, and that's just in my mind, like, it immediately comes up. Not that I want there to be, but how can we keep specialty coffee special while also making it easy? And to what point do we make it easy before it starts to become, all right, I want it to be a little bit harder than that? Does that make sense?
It does. I think if you boil it down to the one point at which specialty coffee is exclusive, it's really price, right? Like that's really the sole, almost necessary factor that will exclude some of its potential audience. Flavor is I think a more complicated point at this point, but really, the reason that it can't be truly broadly inclusive is not necessarily as much about scarcity as it is about price. It should be, a little bit expensive, and it probably should be more expensive than it is now in order to be a sustainable and healthy thing. But I think outside of that, I would say we need to be as inclusive as possible across every point we can, without compromising on things like the value of the product that will ultimately then impact down a supply chain very negatively. It'll impact starting with wages for baristas right the way down to earnings for farmers. So that's one of those things that's not on the table, but everything else kind of is to me. And I think if there's one thing I've sort of accepted in the last few years, is that it isn't binary, really. There isn't specialty and non-specialty. There are a bunch of shades in between those two things that are valuable, important, meaningful tiers or kind of definitions of quality that I don't think we want to necessarily speak negatively about, right? Like the cutoff line of what is specialty moves around a lot depending on whose definition of specialty that you're working with. So I'm getting there. I'm getting to an ultimate point, I promise. I feel like I've kind of worked my around all of these things. When it comes to the word approachable, I think it's a really interesting word that I used to use a lot, and I've sort of stopped using now because of the sort of implications of it, in that it sort of negatively it's a sort of negative on the consumer, that they don't get it. You can't get this. You don't understand this. You don't know enough. You're not smart enough. You're not cool enough. You're not all of those things. So we need to make it easier for you. We need to dumb it down for you. Like that's a sort of a subtext of approachable in a way. Whereas I've just switched, I think, to just inclusive, which is if you are curious, you should be welcome here, right? Like if you want to walk in the door, you should walk in the door. I should remove those barriers to you walking through the front door of my cafe and walking up to my counter. And I think that's a better way of thinking about it than approachable, which is maybe trying to tweak or change some aspects of what we do. And actually, I think it's going back to the beginning, be like, why would someone walk past my door and go to Starbucks or another chain 2 doors down? My product is better. My cafe is nicer. I'm not that much more expensive. Why would they not walk in the door? And I think approachability is a difficult lens to interpret that through, but inclusivity and barriers is another one. And you could look at, okay, well, maybe they, you can't really see where our menu is. You can't really see our prices. We use a bunch of strange words everywhere, which are coffee farm names, and those are kind of confusing and weird and hard to pronounce out loud. Thinking about it through that lens, I think it will will remove barriers and create a more welcoming environment and help us reach more people. Like specialty, while one aspect is flavor, it is and also should be an underlying better business model, and we need to grow that business model in the hope of having a more sustainable industry that exists long term. Coffee doesn't need to exist. It's not nutritional. Caffeine is lovely and helpful to many people, but we're not essential. You know what I mean? And if people stopped farming coffee, the world would turn. It would stop turning for like half a day, and then it would continue to turn. So if we want it to be around, then it's about success of a different kind of business model, which means we have to reach the widest possible audience. We have to do that. And while that widest possible audience may not be drinking the 90 plus kind of coffees every day, they might drink them once in a blue moon, the way that we eat at nice restaurants once in a blue moon. Having a traceably sourced, well-paid 84, 85 point coffee brewed well is not an unpleasant experience. It's not the heights, it's not the giddy heights of what coffee is capable of, but nor is it unpleasant, nor is it not worth drinking, nor is it not worth spending a good amount of money on all the way back through that supply chain, And that's where I feel like the specialty versus commodity almost misses a big chunk of both the current market and the potential future market that is very necessary to grow for us to be a lasting and meaningful and positive industry.
When you mentioned the giddy heights of coffee, of course, we're talking as coffee professionals, and one person's giddy height, who is a coffee professional, might be one consumer's like miserable depth. They might really just hate that Kenya or that whatever it is that you're very, very excited about, and we very much are offended sometimes because we've invested a lot of money into differentiating ourselves to the tune of higher priced coffees and the very specific flavor profiles that we enjoy as roasters and as professionals. And it makes me think that when we're talking about barriers to entry, literally to a coffee shop or just figuratively to the industry, that there are things that we're creating that are barriers, but in the creation of them, we believe that they are just inert differentiators, if you will. They're things that are marketable, and we put them on our bags and we feel like this is amazing, but then we scratch our heads when we're looking at business for the year over year is not what it should be. So the question is how to draw the distinction between something that is a differentiator for your business or even for an industry versus something that is a barrier.
That's a good question. And I think part of that becomes presentation. Part of that becomes, that differentiator. How you present it is a choice, and it's absolutely a choice that it impacts the relationship you have with your customers as well as your brand or your kind of voice or all of that kind of stuff as a kind of gestalt idea. I don't necessarily think I have a whole ton of answers here. I think the one mistake I think that we consistently make is that we, as an industry, we screw up empathy in this really entertaining, slightly bizarre way, which is we create an idealized version of our own selves and the way that we drink coffee, and then we set that as the bar by which we expect a consumer to behave also. I should explain that, and I will. Do you drink terrible coffee in airports at 6 a.m.?
Yes.
Yeah, you do. Have you done that for quite a long time? You probably had a phase where you didn't do that for a hot minute, and you were like, no, I'll wait, or I'll do something weird like brew an AeroPress on the plane.
Oh, yeah, it was beneath me.
Right. You had that phase, and now it's not, right? Like you're sort of back into that place of you're like, no, I do have this need for coffee. Second question, descriptors on bags. How much do you trust them?
Very, very, I used to implicitly, and now I very much don't.
And do you use them to make buying decisions?
I would say once in a blue moon, honestly. It depends on the roaster, but usually not.
So what we do as an industry is we talk about coffee in a way that appeals to our own idealized selves. Not our actual selves who will drink filthy gas station coffee at 5 a.m, not the true selves that doesn't really trust descriptors, but the idealized version of ourselves that absolutely cares about every coffee that they drink, that, it has a very high quality standard, is very informed. But those people don't really exist. They tend to exist temporarily as people go through a kind of phase in their coffee career and their coffee pursuit, but they're not really there. So not only are we not those people, but our customers most definitely are not. But we talk to them as if they are like the best versions of ourselves. And there's something nice in that, but there's also something very disconnecting in that that I think causes a lot of frustration.
Yes, in that is it's the dark night of the soul for the barista. For the the time where you just forums, as we started talking about the early
Mm-hmm.
2000s, were just full of people that were just aghast that there was food in coffee shops at one point. And
Right.
that the purists would never have this. And now we're just like, we love the Australian model where it's just all, it's a full-on
Right.
restaurant.
The one that makes money. Yeah. I think Eva Meister had a quote somewhere, I think it was in a Sprudge article, where she described it as like the era of the no barista, right? Like that there was a lot of no. And I was like, that's such a great description. And I think a lot about that time of the no barista, and it's really well defined in my memory, and I think is a huge defining point for coffee. You talked, a little bit right at the beginning as we started talking about like that period being like the 80s of coffee, where there were things we were proud of and things we were not. I think we should be definitely not proud of the amount of times that we said no, and said, no, that's not appropriate. No, you can't have milk. No, you can't have cream. No, you can't have sugar. No, you can't have fun. No, you can't have a dark roast. No, you can't have an Americano. You will have an expensive pour over. No, you can't use your white laptop in here. No, you can't have Wi-Fi. No. That was just a very defining culture in specialty coffee for a little while, because we were just so driven by the product and so blinkered by it that I think we forgot that, people have to want to like it and want to like us. I feel like that's all kind of tied into where we started.
Yes, and the echoes of that, as much as we would like to consider that we are past that ourselves, I believe that the market is not past that, because the way that this works, I think, and I'd be interested in your opinion on this, is that the people want to latch onto something so that they don't have to think about it too much afterwards. It's just like muscle memory for a barista. I don't really want to think about pouring milk as much as I did when I first started. And if I'm honest, from 20 years in coffee, there's probably some things I still do just because it's hard to undo them once I start. So if the market has been used to their first introduction to specialty, and these people are still alive, making buying decisions, then it makes sense that they still would have a problem accepting that we are accepting.
And yet, like you say, we're still very slowly trending in the direction of being more open and more yes and less no. I think there's a generational shift happening, and we are the outgoing generation, certainly, from a lot of sort of frontline work where a lot of the no's happened. But yeah, I think that shift is still slow to filter right the way through to all our thinking.
Yeah. So definitions are interesting in this conversation to me, because when specialty coffee first started, it was a anti-establishment sort of thing. It was and I think you've written or something either on Twitter or elsewhere about this also, but it was based on, we are not commodity, we are specialty. And I think people rallied around that very well. And now that we're pushing ourselves past certain waves of coffee and movements of coffee, and we were just talking about how there are shades between specialty and commodity that we don't need to talk despairingly of. But the question is it time for a new definition? As the definition sort of expands, how important is it that we have something clear or a charter that's not as narrow as it once was, but isn't so wide that we're just generally accepting of everything for fear of seeming like we're critiquing coffee? So kind of an overcorrection. How do we guard against that? And do definitions sort of help that?
I've always struggled with the more precise definitions of specialty to start with, and I have always worked on, not always, I have, I suppose, for the last 10 years now, worked on a very broad definition of specialty, which is coffee that is sold at a premium above market price based on its taste. And I think I quite like the fuzziness of that. I quite like that there are coffees included in that would make people a little bit angry. Do you know what I mean? But they're like, but it's not better just because it's more expensive because of its taste. Well, if it's derived from its taste and then I think ultimately then that is specialty. You may not like the taste, but if other people value it, then it is as valid a preference as yours. So, I think that it's a better acknowledgement of the number of opportunities for quality retention and loss in the supply chain. As much as historically we've had this definition of specialty as a raw material that hasn't really then captured what happens to it between becoming a roasted coffee bean and a brewed beverage. That's always frustrated me. So I kind of figure I'm happy enough with that wider definition, because it is a bit more inclusive of those coffees that are on the fringes of specialty. You know what I mean? If they're still worth more because people like that chocolatey, heavy texture, low acidity, then I'm okay with you charging a little bit more than market rate for them. And I think it does still pit us firmly against underpriced coffees that are, exploitatively traded at disgracefully low prices. It still gives us a position of contrast and pushing back against the sort of endemic evil business model that underlies all of coffee.
Right. So in the description you're discussing is it's not just price of the coffee itself that the consumer buys, like a $64 cup of coffee now. I was in London recently. It's the price that the farmer receives for the coffee too.
I think I would rather have this broader open definition than one, like I said, I'd rather an inclusive definition than an exclusive one. It's for me, same sort of thing. So yeah, it can be about where it's bought. I'm pretty open to, but I mean, ultimately, a more expensive coffee to the farm is going to be a more expensive cup of coffee too. So, unless someone's making a very foolish decision in the middle, and they won't be making that decision for a hugely long period of time, so they can be ignored, I think. So yeah, for me, I would still leave it defined for me as a kind of at the consumer point, at the point of final sale to consumer, either as a bag of coffee or as a cup of coffee. That's the moment, in a funny sort of way, that it retains or gains its definition of specialty.
I actually appreciate the idea of just latching onto that fuzzy definition, as you put it, because then it seems like it encourages us to become or remain more mindfully engaged with the process, where what I was describing, the market and the consumer might want to not necessarily have to think about all of these things. It really behooves us to actually always think about these things, because that's the whole reason why they wouldn't have to think about it, is because we've done the thinking in part for them. So if we have a narrow definition, it really excuses us from having to look at the nuances and make ethical calls where if it matches up all of our criteria, we can mentally just check out.
Right. I think that's an absolute kind of goal for many consumers, in the way that they may make one or two decisions about where they buy their coffee and then just keep buying it because they like buying coffee from there. And the part of their brain that worries about the ethics has been switched off at the start by we've built trust in some regard early on, and we have not broken the trust along the way. And yeah, it doesn't become an ethical test every time I go and buy a cup of coffee somewhere. It doesn't become a thing I can do wrong. I can just pick whatever I want from the place that I like, and I feel fine about it, and I trust them, and I feel like I'm participating in something more positive than negative.
That's helpful, because that really gains momentum in the market, and rather than a lot of people having to just do a mental workout every time. And I was working on some sustainability episodes and talking with Pachamama out in California, farmer-owned cooperative, and his Thalion, the CEO of the organization, was discussing how brand is so important in this, in how you're just echoing the same sentiment, which is that you trust these people, and that makes it easy for you to continue supporting them, and probably in larger scale than you would if you did have to make those ethical choices every single time.
Yeah, I think so. I think that brand relationship is huge.
I'm interested in the idea of taste, because also we tend to be we're very competitive around taste. All the things that we have competitions around focus on the taste of a coffee. We weigh it heavily as a definition of or defining part of specialty, but it doesn't seem we're very competitive on the other things around specialty, like the ethics of it, like, considering that all players are taken care of, and we have this mimetic effect of, like counterculture putting out a transparency report, and then other people start in kind putting out more transparency reports. And so that seems competitive in an unofficial way. Do you feel like we could do with more of that kind of competitive nature around the other aspects of specialty coffee rather than just taste?
That is a good question. The gut instinct is yes, because I think while we are competitive, we are also in a position where if we are smart, we should probably be also somewhat collaborative. And I think transparency around aspects of how we do business can be very helpful for an industry as a whole to improve what it's doing and move in a less damaging direction, shall we say. Better is difficult when we're still ultimately, participants in a complicated and unpleasant industry from a trade perspective, shall we say. That sounds really depressing. I'm sorry. I just, personally, I'm still very stuck in the space where, the scales have fallen from my eyes, and I'm like, oh, I'm still participating in colonialism. I'm just doing it with more money going to the producer, but I'm still in the same system as everyone else. I'm still doing this thing. So, I get very hesitant to talk much about doing good or doing better when we're still going to be working within this particular system until we can break out of it. Then I think we could talk about doing less harm or less damage, but probably I'd be reluctant to go too far in the other direction, because most of the things that we've tried, like paying higher prices and that kind of stuff, hasn't really had the effect that we'd hoped it would, and so we're still somewhat complicit. But that's not for right now. I feel like I've wandered way away from the question in trying to answer it.
It does kind of zero in on some part of what each link in the value chain does with its responsibilities, and how it is beholden to a certain set of responsibilities for those around them. So doing good by as much as you can, the farmer, and the customer, and anywhere in between. And the cafe, is an interesting thing where it is where either the ball is picked up and ran to the goal, or it's fumbled in many cases. And it's fascinating to me to watch coffee shops go up and down, literally just get built and then get closed really quick. And it's tragic in a way, because the barrier to entry in terms of opening a coffee shop is not even comparable to what you would need to do to start a coffee farm, or even an importing company or something like that. So I wonder, when we're considering things that we can do in specialty to create maybe a better future, or maybe a more inclusive way of operating, what role does the cafe, in your mind, play in the value chain? And the follow-up to that, I suppose, is, in what ways has it contributed to the problems that we see in the supply chain?
Oh, it's probably a question that's going to get me into trouble, but I'll have a go. So, coffee shops have definitely... Okay, so the low barrier to entry to coffee shops has been a good thing and a terrible thing. And the fact that we've not been terribly transparent or honest as an industry about how hard it is to create and run a good coffee shop. This, I would point the blame primarily at roasters, who historically have been, enabling people who shouldn't start coffee shops to start coffee shops, because there's probably some equipment sales and a bit of coffee sales in there for a little while. So, there's a financial motivation for them to just keep bringing people to the industry, and not really being like, maybe don't yet, maybe go and work in one once, twice for a year or so, go and think about what you're doing. Roasters have welcomed with open arms anyone and everyone who's been willing to give them money. And I think that's a mistake that we have seen, have consequences ongoing. I think coffee shops are essential because, everything, all the money that really flows into the supply chain starts with what the consumer spends on a cup of coffee or a bag of coffee. And so having coffee shops out there in the world that have really high levels of trust, high levels of consistency, that consistently make people's days better, that is very necessary for the sort of progression of this industry, where there's just a bit more money flowing through the supply chain all the way down to certainly producers and everyone except roasters, who are generally fine in all of this situation. Like, roasters are the most de-risked, and roasters are probably by and large the most profitable section of the coffee industry, so I'm not hugely concerned about them as a whole. But I think coffee shops need to find ways to be more profitable and sustainable, and so does everyone else before a coffee roaster too. So coffee shops hold tremendous power and influence over the industry, and I think because historically we've had a really diverse mix of people coming in, well, in terms of mindset or goals when they open a coffee shop. A lot of people open a coffee shop to not work in an office anymore. A lot of people open a coffee shop because they like coffee shops, and a lot of people open coffee shops because they're passionate about serving great coffee to people. And that's that. And there's people, I suppose, who open them to make money, but those are relatively few and far between, because if that's their goal, they'll probably pick a slightly easier field to do that thing in if it's just about financial return. And so we haven't had really coherence of vision amongst coffee shops as a whole, which is why they haven't had almost a collective power over roasters or other people like that, because, again, knowledge, power essentially has been more centralized with coffee roasters than anyone else historically. I'm aware that I have a coffee roasting company and I'm just throwing myself under the bus repeatedly, but we're trying to be better people and do better. But this, you can't really deny that this is the nature of the industry. So I think if we had more sustainable businesses run by people driven by serving great coffee to people, building trust with their consumers, and creating a sustainable industry and a sustainable business for themselves that way, that would have really positive ripples right through the industry as a whole, because I think it would just uncork a little bit more money to flow back down to producers in a more sustainable manner, and to more than just the top 10% of their coffee production, which is, I think, a really important thing that we don't talk enough about. Like, we could keep skimming the cream off the top and paying more and more and more for the cream, but that doesn't really change the fact that they may not be getting what they should be getting for the bulk of their production.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, because we are taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, in a sense, with coffee bars, and in the fact that they are closing at such high rates. It does seem like a very shaky link in the value chain because of that. And in a sense, what I hear you saying is that the barrier to entry for starting a coffee shop should be a little bit more robust, and with a bit more of a unified purpose behind it, and then versus the inclusivity and low barrier to entry for the customer of that coffee shop.
Absolutely. I don't know. I find it. I'm still slightly surprised that I was just allowed to start a business. I'm not allowed to start, practicing dentistry or medicine when I want to. I usually have to prove some form of competence ahead of time, and there's a lot of fields where what you're doing has risk involved, and so you have to show some level of competence before you do it. Opening a business can carry staggering risk, and you can have a massive impact on the livelihoods and lives of a huge number of sort of stakeholders in your business, but there's no need to prove any sort of competence there. And that isn't to say, people are incompetent. Everyone is an incompetent doctor until they learn how to do it, right? Like, no one is born with innate knowledge of medicine. You go and you learn and you prove that you've learned this thing. We just don't have any barrier to entry for any sort of business. And that blows my mind a little bit. And I'm aware that putting up more barriers or gatekeeping things is not a good thing or a desirable thing, but if at least there was a process to pass through where some solid understanding was gained of P&Ls and balance sheets and base business sort of modeling and projections and the kind of dull stuff that you need to understand. And I went into opening a coffee business as someone who had some vague claim to expertise in coffee, but absolutely none in the business of coffee. And the penny dropped, after we opened the business, which is an embarrassing time for that to happen. And that freaked me out, and it sent me down a rabbit hole of that thing for a long time. And I, in the early days of Square Mile, when I was meeting with lots of cafe owners, would do the best I could to put the fear into them about opening a business, to make them freak out properly, because I didn't feel like enough of them did. And, the ones that had done more freaking out ahead of time generally opened way better businesses. And those are businesses that are running today because they were like, okay, no, this is the thing I have to get good at. I have to be good at my coffee. I have to be good at the service. I have to be good at food. And I have to be good at actually doing a stock take properly, factoring that in, understanding what that means for my P&L for this month, and making a decision to make a change based on what's happening right now. You know what I mean? Like that's not a mindset that many people start with. But, if you could get people to freak out enough, then that would happen.
Yeah, I like that. Getting them to freak out is an asset, I'm sure. And being a party pooper or a buzzkill, whatever phrase you want to use to be the unpopular one, we tend to be very affirming of things that might not deserve affirmation, or at least in the moment. It's like when I used to teach a lot of latte art. There were some trainers that I would work with that would praise profusely the worst things for it. And I was always of the opinion that I should reserve my highest praise for their highest achievement, only because then they would have, the history of, boy, there wasn't a lot of praise and now there is. This means something.
Yes.
And so this affirmation we give people, and especially now where, you've got all of the, they're not trying to harm people in doing this, but like Gary Vee and everyone else like that just pushes people into entrepreneurship. It does produce this glut of eventual failure, not because people are unintelligent, but maybe they're not as, again, mindful as they should be. So that's really great that you did that with your wholesale customers, because you probably, like you said, you did save a lot of people a lot of pain, them and the people that are depending on them to be stable as a business.
The stories of unpaid wages when businesses fail are not, sadly, particularly rare. The story of unpaid suppliers or unpaid, you know what I mean? Like, business failures have consequences that in almost every country, the person who started that business can relatively cleanly walk away from. You know what I mean? And I think that's troubling, and also has had a massive, frustrating and sort of added a lot of friction to the healthy growth of specialty.
We're talking about this in the middle of the worst thing to happen to coffee shops ever, COVID.
Yes.
And we were discussing this very before we recorded. I had seen you at Coffee Fest New York, and that was right at the cusp of this thing happening. And we were both like, well, should we even be here? It was very tentative. Yep. And it's been a train wreck for retail in particular, of course, everyone else in the world, but everyone is focused on how to recalibrate and use this as an opportunity to sort of look to the future to build resiliency into their models. And as we're talking about this, I wonder specifically now when we're talking about coffee shops, what kind of model or aspects of doing business do you feel would be the best for coffee shops to focus on right now to become more resilient, to kind of be that sustainable and consistent source of good business for their employees and everyone involved in the value chain?
That is the $1 million question. Okay, I'll start with a positive that is a negative, but it becomes a positive, and then we'll deal with the more difficult things, which is in a year's time, for most people who have coffee shops now that have suffered under the increasing levels of competition that we've seen in the last decade, it's going to be a very different trading environment. So essentially, if you can make it through this, then you're going to go into an environment that has way less competition in it. There is simply going to be less coffee shops there, and there will be some very healthy opportunities for growth on the other side. This is almost macabre, I know, and sort of a sort of depressing aspect of it, but to some extent, the contraction that is very rapidly happening through COVID was going to happen anyway, because almost every city in the world had too many coffee shops in relationship to the number of people willing to spend the money and drink nice coffee from them. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and it does sound depressing at first, and that's been something we've wrestled with on the show. But yes, I definitely agree with that.
So there is going to be a contraction. It was to some extent inevitable. It's now going to happen just a lot faster. And there's going to be some depressing aspect of this. There's going to be a bunch of consolidation with companies with tons of cash come in and just buy up lots of little players because they're going to be cheap, and that's going to be sad and depressing and less diverse, and that bit's bad. But there's definitely a carrot here in terms of like, should I just shut up shop now? Should I just give in to this thing? Well, I think if you have long-term aspirations and goals, it's about battening down the hatches and getting through this next phase to be open on the other side of this, when I think there'll be some real opportunities to grow and have a much healthier business, bizarrely. It seems weird and gross to talk about, but it is what's going to happen, so I don't feel like it's helpful to pretend otherwise. Now, I'll try and wrestle a bit with the much more difficult question that you asked, which is like, what is the model that works right now? And I think that I don't know. We don't know. It is a time to experiment and to be flexible. And I'm not saying this is the time for endless compromise, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I mean, I started, we started Square Mile in 2008 as the world crashed, as the global economy was going through that whole thing. And it forced us to change tack a whole bunch of times and be flexible. And the aspiration of the business, the goal, never changed, but our approach to that definitely changed constantly as we tried to adapt to a shifting world. And I think that's just going to have to be true now. What will work in the next year is largely unknown and unexplored, because we need to start exploring different opportunities or models. I think that it's definitely going to be worth keeping a very, very close eye on your actual numbers, not your start of the project number spreadsheets, the sort of spreadsheets that you do when you cost up a product, or the spreadsheets that you do at the beginning that will tell you a lovely story of how wonderfully profitable this thing will be. But the actual, in the UK we would call them management accounts, but what do you think is going to happen, but what happened in the last month? Like I think it's definitely a time where spending a little bit from an accounting perspective to have really accurate numbers around what's working and what's not is going to be essential. Like that will allow you to experiment with finding customers in different ways, delivering to customers in different ways, changing your product mix in different ways. But if you don't know what that's doing to the underlying business model in real time, you can have what looks like an apparent success that catches up with you 3 months later, and then you run out of cash and everything breaks. So I don't know what the model is. Like I don't. It's so dependent on different government support and regulation and that kind of stuff. Like the UK government has just announced today like some changes in how it's going to be supporting people who will be working less potentially. We obviously had a furlough scheme, and we just had a lot more support for businesses. I'm aware in the US, from the outside, it looks like there's been vague opportunities to borrow money as long as you're a giant company or a famous person, and then a $1,200 check. But apart from that, not a whole lot that's really sort of helped cafe owners retain baristas, retain teams, which has been, I suppose, sad to see in the US. And I can't imagine that it's going to have a particularly kind effect to hospitality as a whole.
Well, as you're discussing that, I think it really does open up the possibility of having a large variety of models if the underlying financials are robust and promising. As long as it makes financial sense, you probably could get away with a lot of different models of doing a coffee bar, and probably will need to, because agility does seem like more of an asset than ever right now, where it used to be that people would just mimic each other's coffee shops and, get on Instagram and say, well, my idol is doing this, I should do that too.
Right.
Now it's probably the riskiest thing you possibly could do.
I think so. I think, we are starting to see some interesting shifts and other stuff. I'm hesitant to pull certain levers, and I would say, I think the lever of discount is the last lever ever to pull, because you end up in this really difficult place where you might see some real growth from that discounting initially, and then you're stuck with the question of, did I enable people to access this thing and then they're going to stick with me when the price goes up, or are they just here because it's cheap? And in which case, if it's the latter, well, I can never put my prices back up. And I certainly saw this amongst a lot of roasters online when the sort of pandemic hit. They started pushing out discount code. And then they, saying for the next month, it's 25% off. And then at the end of the month, they were like, we're going to do another month of 25% off because we've clearly seen a growth, but now we don't understand the growth. You know what I mean? Is it just discount-driven growth? Is it just cheaper price-driven growth? Or did people come anyway and happen to use the discount code while they were there and appreciate that gesture? So I'm very against price as a lever to pull. In saying that, the big chain here, Pret a Manger, I'll just call them Pret for the sake of ease, launched a subscription service that looks on the face of it completely insane. To be like £20 will buy you unlimited hot drinks for the month, which makes no sense on paper. As you look at it like that, you're like, I could buy, I think they're capped per day, and someone did the maths, and you can buy 155 hot drinks from Pret for £20 if you really wanted to. Now, I would say, hopefully, someone's gone in and done the maths about how often does the typical consumer visit, and actually, if they increase their visits by 20%, and we broke even on the hot drinks from those visits, how much food and other product would they buy at the same time, and would we have a net lift in revenue? Right, which is a complicated calculation to do, but it would seem likely that someone has tried to do the maths behind it and say, at cost, £20 buys, probably 40 drinks a month. So that's maybe, 5 working days in a week, like a drink and a half a day on average. But if they buy that at cost from us, they will typically buy more sandwiches, they'll buy more little sweet treat snack bars or whatever else it is, and overall they'll spend more than before, or at least enough on higher margin products that were in a healthy place. I'm not suggesting that coffee shops do the same thing, but I'm intrigued by the lack of people who have explored stuff like memberships or recurring subscriptions within coffee shop models. It doesn't seem like a lot's been done yet, and that's interesting. And you don't have to be this many free drinks. There's no rules here. You can do what you like. Can you offer a compelling proposition that gives someone one more reason to visit that doesn't compromise your underlying financials? And again, it's all the way back to experiment, but check your results. Do the full amount of work, and don't just look at your top line sales. Look at what it's done to the underlying financial model underneath.
Those are wise words for sure. And as you're describing that and going through like what somebody hypothetically could have done, probably did before that thing launched, I imagine there's a lot of people thinking, well, I don't put that much forethought into the downstream effect of putting together a BOGO deal. I just do it because sales are down and I'm desperate. And that kind of discipline in the midst of desperation seems like one of the keys.
One thing I do want to talk about that I think is worth discussing is the fact that the pandemic has changed the way a lot of people drink coffee at home. And I think coming out of this, or as coffee shops begin to try and trade their way out of this, there is absolutely going to be a temptation for coffee shops to cut costs when it comes to suppliers, right? In a scramble for money, I absolutely understand that some people would be like, if I can just drop my coffee bill by 20% a month, that will give me a little bit of flexibility, and I need all of the money. And I agree, all of the money is necessary, but I think compromising your experience right now is probably the worst time to do that, because the experience of coffee at home for many people has gotten significantly better in the last 3 months. all the data I'm seeing from people all over the world is that people are buying a ton of home espresso equipment, a ton of home brewing equipment. They're grinding in ever greater numbers than ever. They're buying very good coffee from roasters, and they're probably brewing really pretty good coffee at home. And in the past, the upgrade between coffee I might make at home versus the coffee from the nice coffee shop, that definitely justified the spending money at the coffee shop because they do a nicer job. It's quicker, it's easier, it's all of those things. But now you have tens of thousands of people around the world who have pretty good setups at home, whose base level of quality has come up because of the pandemic. And I think if the experience of going to a coffee shop is not as good as it was, and they're going to be asking themselves, is it worth the money? Is it worth the risk to my health or the health of those around me? And I think in many cases the answer will be no. I'm just going to keep brewing coffee at home. It's kind of fun. I'm kind of getting into it. I'm brewing pretty good coffee. I can just buy it online and it can deliver right through my door, and that's beautiful and easy. I think we've never seen coffee brewing at home as being competitive to cafes experiences, but I think now temporarily for the next year or so, there is going to be a bit of competition between coffee at home and coffee in the cafe in a way that we haven't really had before, and I don't anticipate happening really again outside of a pandemic. But right now it's weird times, and that is, I think, changing consumer expectations around coffee in a coffee shop.
So that experience aspect, and of course, back to the top of our conversation, the inclusivity that we employ in our coffee shop seems to factor in heavily here.
Very much so.
So we've talked about a ton of things here. There is a lot more we could talk about. But one of the things that I think we are going to be up against in the future, as not just one thing, but many different problems. They're just business, as they say. Danny Meyer, in his book, Setting the Table, I remember, his mentor said, business is problems. And therefore, having a framework to think through things, or at least a guiding principle, is helpful. And I respect how you think about topics like what we've been discussing and the things that you cover on your channel and throughout your writings. And so I wonder if you would share with us going forward maybe what the most helpful mindset is to approach problems that we are going to have to tackle as we continue in specialty, especially in the retail world.
That's a great question, or a great ask, I suppose, in a different kind of way. I'm aware that I have an underlying optimism in my outlook to the world, and I'm aware that there's a number of reasons I probably have that optimism. I think the mindset is, for me, this is worthwhile. Doing this right is worthwhile. It's worthwhile because it can have a positive impact on the lives of your stakeholders, which is anyone and anyone connected to or affected by your business. And you can have a net positive impact on them and, of course, on you. I think we get to be one of the few businesses that just makes people's days better. That's what we exchange for money, really. We sell a little bit of happiness, and that, again, is also very much worthwhile. And so that there is, beyond just money in the bank at the end of the day, beyond the profit retained by the business in this very black and white manner, I think it's worthwhile. There is satisfaction there is pleasure there, and there is positive impact, and you can leave the world a little bit better than when you found it by doing what we do well. So firstly, there is, I hope, motivation to keep going, because right now for a lot of people it doesn't feel worthwhile, and I accept that, and it doesn't feel worth fighting for in some ways when the challenge is so large like this, but I do think it is. And in terms of the mindset, beyond that, I really think it's easy for business to feel like, you are the tail being wagged by the dog as a human being, as the owner, right? You suffer at the whims of your business, and you're not in control of your business as much as the business is kind of in control of your life or your happiness. And I think that the reason I'm so obsessed with this insight. I just want all of the numbers. I want to know what's going on all the time. So I want all of the financials, because it gives me some semblance of control. And running a business feels lonely, and it rarely feels like you're in control of it. But I think, don't be afraid to be less alone. But if you're going to have constructive conversations about how things are going with other business owners, you need to really understand your business as well. It's okay to feel collaborative, and the other good shop in town is not your competition right now. I know we talked about them kind of being competition, but it's difficult not to present this as a contradiction, because I think there is huge value in collaborative sort of work, but I'm aware that there's also a hyper competitive time in the market. So, I suppose you can be more picky and choosy and try and find people you don't feel are direct competitors to be more collaborative with. I certainly have much more open conversations about finances and all of that kind of stuff with roasters outside of London, and I'm very open with people who I don't really see as competition about that stuff, because connecting openly about the state of your business is very helpful, because it's going to be different to someone else's, and that contrast is going to teach you both something useful.
This has really, truly been a great conversation. I appreciate you being on the show and sharing these insights with us. I feel silly asking, but I ask every guest, where can we find more information about James Hoffmann and the work that you do?
See, this now requires me to present myself as a YouTuber, which as a 40-year-old man, I never thought I'd do. You can find me on YouTube, James Hoffmann. You can find me doing sort of coffee-related stuff at Square Mile Coffee Roasters and a few other places. You can just go to jameshoffman.co.uk and have the full car crash resume of my current portfolio career, I think is the nice way people describe it, where you just do a lot of different stuff and have nothing particularly coherent in your life. So yeah, you can, so that's a pretty good place to sort of to find me. All good bookstores, hopefully, still, I think, hopefully, with the Atlas. But yeah, that aside, I think that's enough. I hate talking about what I do for a living, because it makes me feel like a fraud, because I'm not even sure what I do for a living anymore.
Well, we appreciate you, James. And again, I appreciate you being on the show. Thank you so much.
Delighted to be here. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope today's discussion with James gave you some great insights and ideas to help you guide your approach to coffee. So much of what I get from today's interview goes back to the idea that we live in a tension between creating a special experience for the consumer that is both unique and inclusive, and really our ability to thrive into the future as retailers will depend greatly on how we cultivate trust and let our business decisions be guided by both a robust focus on the numbers and metrics for the health of our business itself, as James was discussing here towards the end, and the continual empathy towards those we are serving coffee to through our businesses. And so a huge and sincere thank you to James for joining us here at Keys to the Shop. If you want more great content and information from James, you can go to jameshoffman.co.uk, and that's James Hoffmann with 2 N's, by the way. And also James Hoffmann on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to his channel and go out there and buy the World Atlas of Coffee book. That's a great thing to have in your cafe library or in your own library at home. So again, thank you, James. We so appreciate you. Now, if you want to contact me directly with any feedback, questions, or comments, or inquiries into working with Keys to the Shop Consulting, you can contact me by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS @keystotheshop.com. I always love hearing from the Keys to the Shop audience. And with that, that is the end of our episode today. I hope you have an awesome day and that you really enjoyed this conversation with James Hoffmann. And as always, I truly hope that this episode has given you keys to the shop.